Thank you, Professor. Sorry for rushing you to the end, and thank you for the detailed explanation regarding how the Odyssey platform can contribute to the management of supersparse water and the control of invasive species. So to address the environmental problems caused by the ship-sparse water and invasive alien species that come along with it, the contracting parties to the Barcelona Conventions have been taking concrete action since more than a decade ago. And one of the products was the Mediterranean Regional Strategy, specifically targeting this challenge. This strategy has been distributed among all the participants before this webinar. The strategy was adopted at COP17 in 2012, and an assessment of its implementation was carried out in 2016. Since its adoption, the regulatory framework of the ship-sparse water and the related matters has seen quite substantive changes, both internationally and regionally, notably with the coming into force of the Ballast Water Management Convention itself, its amendments and adoption of the integrated monitoring and assessment program and the related assessment criteria for the Mediterranean Sea, and which is known as the IMAP in 2016 by the contracting parties to the Barcelona Convention. In this regard, the contracting parties mandated REMPEC to update the strategy and action plan on ship-sparse water management in order to achieve good environmental status. At the moment, REMPEC is collaborating with BARAC in carrying out this activity. So now I would like to invite our consultant, Dr. Lin Jackson, to provide an overview of the strategy and the related proposed update. So before I give the floor to Dr. Jackson, please know that we are going to extend this webinar a little bit because we are overrunning in time, but we will try to finish all the things on the program. Thank you. Dr. Jackson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. As Wentao said, I'm working with REMPEC and SPARAC to update the ballast water management strategy for the Mediterranean. Can we have my slides, please? Okay, next slide. I think Wentao already covered quite a bit of this, so I'll be able to go through it quite fast. The strategy was adopted in 2012 with objectives to have a regional approach to ballast water management and to have it consistent with the Ballast Water Management Convention requirements. Okay, next slide. Next slide. So just to look at the framework of the strategy, it's got there are 8 strategic priorities. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? So there are 8 strategic priorities plus an action plan which has 8 measures to be implemented at regional, sub-regional and national levels. The strategy, as you see, was to be implemented between 2011 and 2015, so it is somewhat out of date. Annex 1 includes a timetable for the implementation. Annex 2 covers harmonized voluntary arrangements, and those were specifically related to the ballast water exchange and the achievement of the D1 standard, as IMO explained before. And then Annex 3 proposed a regional compliance monitoring and enforcement system, and Annex 4 had provided details of a proposed information exchange system. So if we can go to the next slide. The strategic priorities then were to support the international instruments and obviously the Ballast Water Management Convention as a priority, to support capacity building initiatives. And at the time, Globallast was functioning, to improve understanding of ship-mediated introductions, and that included two components. It was both related to building more general public awareness around both ballast water and invasive species generally, but also to establish an information exchange system. Then the fourth priority was to promote the use of risk assessment in the management of ballast water. And I think Megan before outlined in quite a bit of detail the various different ways that risk assessment can be used. Then the adoption of voluntary regional arrangements and promote sub-regional and national alignment with those arrangements. And as I said before, those are linked to the ballast water exchange. Then to consider strategies in other regional seas, and particularly obviously the adjacent regional seas, to try and align the strategy in the Mediterranean with the adjacent regional seas, and then have periodic review and assessment. And I put 2016 there because an assessment was done in 2016. And then obviously the last one, resource mobilization, to try and get some of the activities off the ground. So if we can have the next slide, please. So it spelled out 8 different measures, and I've got in brackets afterwards the strategic priority which that is related to. So specifically looking at ratification of the Ballast Water Management Convention by the contracting parties to the Barcelona Convention. Again, harmonized arrangements for ballast water exchange, a CME system, looking at establishing a biological monitoring system for ports, capacity building, public awareness, information exchange network, and the review linked into the Barcelona Convention reporting system. You can move to the next slide. So, as I said, the status of implementation was assessed in 2016. So, the information that was contained in that report is now quite out of date in many respects. The report, for example, said that in 2016, only 10 of the 21 Barcelona Convention contracting parties had ratified the Ballast Water Management Convention. But when I checked a few weeks ago with the data on the IMO website, there are actually now 13. So that's just an example. It's not that easy to follow up. I've only been working on this a couple of weeks, so I haven't had time to follow up on a lot of the other things. The report did say that there had been progress in harmonizing the ballast water exchange measures, and that port surveys had been completed in at least some of the sub-regions. And a number of capacity building initiatives had been completed. Globallast partnerships, obviously, but that's now finished. The EMSA's, the European Maritime Safety Administration, had done some, and SPARAC had done quite a few. One of the areas that was identified that was clearly had there only been limited progress was in the establishment of an information exchange network. But I think we've heard some encouraging reports this morning, both on the MAMIRS project that RACSPA is involved with, and in this Odyssey project, that there's been a lot of potential for using those initiatives to come up with something which will also satisfy the requirements of trying to implement the risk assessments, for example, in the Mediterranean. So I think we need to look at that in more depth as we move into the process of updating the strategy. Next slide. So as Winter also mentioned, there have been some really key developments since 2016, and in a sense they're even more important than the looking at what the level of implementation has been. So there's entry into force of the convention itself, entry into force of a number of amendments to the convention, and the adoption of the Integrated Monitoring and Assessment Program, IMAP, for the Mediterranean, and Artef spoke about that a little, as well as the updated action plan on species introductions into the Mediterranean, which was adopted last year. And at the moment, the regional strategy for the prevention and response to marine pollution is also in progress, and that's important because it also has a component which deals with trying to promote ratification of IMO conventions more generally. Next slide. I'm going to look at a couple of these developments in a little bit more detail because they have particular implications for this updating of the strategy. So Megan talked earlier about the D1 and the D2 standards. So D1 relates to ballast water exchange, and D2 relates to requires management or treatment of ballast water prior to discharge. And then she also talked about the process for approving ballast water management systems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the first of those because it's particularly important for updating the strategy. So if we can move to the next slide. Good. So the ballast water exchange, when the convention was first adopted, there were no effective ballast water treatment systems available. And so in a sense, ballast water exchange was adopted as an interim measure to allow for some kind of management of ballast water discharges. And I think Megan explained those. What's important in terms of now the strategy is that the D1 standard will be phased out. This updated strategy will cover the period 2021 to 2025. And as you can see from this diagram, the D1 standard, so ballast water exchange, will be phased out by 2024. And over that time period, there will be increasingly a requirement for more and more different types of ships, and depending on the date they were built and their size and that sort of thing, the requirement for them to have treatment will come into force. And by 2024, all ships will be required to have ballast water treatment systems in place unless they have applied and received the exemptions that were also talked about earlier. So if we can go on. So this is particularly important because in the current strategy, ballast water exchange is kind of one of the strategic priorities. And so to my mind, what we need to do now is to place a lot more emphasis on looking at how to achieve the D2 standard and exemptions. So the emphasis needs to shift over the next period of the strategy. We can move to the next slide. So I think I don't need to go into detail here because this has been talked about already. The exemptions are primarily granted to vessels with voyages between specified ports or locations, so the same risk area approach that Megan talked about earlier, and which is outlined in the IMO guidelines. And I think it was very useful to hear the presentation from HELCOM, where they've been developing a harmonized approach around exemptions. And I think what we need to do is to look at their example in more detail and adopt a similar approach for the Mediterranean as part of the updated strategy. Next slide. And then, as Atif was talked about and I mentioned a little while ago, the IMAP, which was adopted in 2016, has introduced the concept of GES, or Good Environmental Status, which is defined in terms of various descriptions and indicators. And he already described this indicator 6, which deals with non-indigenous invasive species, or NIS. And there's a definition and operational objectives and targets associated with that. Now, the brief for updating the strategy specifically says it needs to be updated with a view to achieving GES. And so it needs to, this becomes a fundamental objective of the strategy as well. If we can move to the next slide. So the updating of the strategy was initiated with the adoption of the work program at COP21 last year, which included provision for updating of the strategy to achieve GES. It obviously needs to take cognizance of all the other key developments, of which I mentioned a few now, and needs to address areas where there has been limited implementation, try to get some understanding of why the implementation has been limited, and perhaps propose some additional activities which will help to push those forward. So the process was initiated in August and by REMPEC in collaboration with SPARAC, and so I'm the consultant that's working with them on this process. The next slide. So just to outline the process, I have done some preliminary work, but I will be producing a first draft of the updated strategy by the 16th of October. That will then be circulated to all the contracting parties for comment, and the comments will be collated and then returned to me to incorporate into a second draft, and as well as producing a table with looking at comments and responses, and why or why not comments have been taken into account in the second draft of the strategy. So I think that's all. Thank you.